Hello, good day to you. Welcome back to American Lit, session 19. I am Thelma English. Glad to see you again. I hope your week went well, and I hope that you are loving Uncle Tom's Cabin. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the privilege of home education. And Lord, I am grateful that each of these young people or adults have chosen to learn the better way, the harder way, the best way. I pray that you would bless each family represented in the rooms where people are listening, and that you would bless us, that we could become more like you, that we could become better Christians, that we could become better people and better Americans. We thank you for blessing us during this time. In Jesus' name, amen. Session 19. This is out of 31 sessions. You are more than halfway done with this class if you are watching one video every week. And if you're doing the paper writing and all of that, you're earning 1 high school credit. Our devotion, again, is from the Valley of Vision. And last week, you had someone volunteer to read this week. You can pause the video for someone to read that devotion now. All right, let's continue our schedule review. This is session 19. We're going to have a quiz in just a few slides on chapters 10 through 18. And this week you are reading in Uncle Tom's Cabin, chapters 19 to 27. And your writing project, you should start working on that now if you have not already, because you've got an assignment that is due session 22, and this is session 19. So you have a paper that is due. You need to have decided what kind of paper and who you are writing about. Take a look at your paper copy of the schedule to have those writing parameters reviewed for you again. Let's go ahead and pause the video for our quiz. Okay, we're back. That wasn't a very hard quiz. Number 14. The answer is at the very end of chapter 18. And so if you didn't finish your reading this week, well, then you missed number 14. Let's take a look at slavery and the Constitution. We have been looking at the Constitution and looking at slavery because it's such a dark part of our history. We all need to understand slavery and the lasting effects that it has on our culture today. It's even more important in 2023 that we realize there are people living today whose great grandparents were slaves. And there are plenty of people today who've come over from other places during great migrations in the 1940s and 50s, people who came here who never had anything to do with slavery. So it's very difficult today to blame the people today on the slavery of yesterday. But if you are Black or part Black and have relatives who were slaves, then you, of course, have a grievance. You have a cross to bear. You have something that happened in your family that was horrific that you have to deal with and decide, do you blame the people who are living here, or do you blame the people of the past who did that? And as far as reparations, we've been doing reparations since the 1950s. Are they being done correctly? Should they be done differently? What should change about that? And these are good topics, not for this class as far as discussing reparations. These are topics for you and your relatives around the dinner table, things for you to ask your pastor and people that you feel are wise and have wisdom to offer you to figure out, how do we disconnect from our past? A good example is to think about persons who are adopted. people who are adopted, very often, they can't face their past because they don't know the past. Usually they don't know who their mother and father are, or you may be somebody like me who grew up with only a mother, and you kind of knew that your dad was out there, but you never called anyone dad. In fact, when I refer to my biological father, and I didn't have any other father, when I refer to my father, I call him Phil by his first name because that's what my mom called him when she referred to him, and we never were old enough to call him dad. He wasn't part of our life. So someone like us that really doesn't have that part of the family history, you don't know. My dad's family was embarrassed of us, and so we had no help from them, and we had no communication with them. And if you have slavery in your family history, it may be that you have no written records. If you are adopted, you have no written records, probably beyond your adopted parents. And some people have a very difficult time ever getting past this, not knowing about the past or blaming things on the past. And some people move on without any issue. If you're somebody who is not moving on from slavery, past history, from so long ago, or adoption, not knowing your family history or medical history, not knowing who your real quote unquote parents are, then perhaps you need to get a little bit of help so that you can move on past this, so that we can be living in 2023 and not living with the past doing our living for us, if that makes any sense. That's just a word of encouragement. Slavery in the Constitution, there is mention of slavery in the Constitution, not exactly the word slave. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And if you don't have that memorized, you should. The Articles of Confederation, they were ratified in 1781, a little later. Now, the independent 13 states could work together because these are Articles of Confederation. They're forming a confederation. Its defects were soon apparent. There was no way to raise money for common purposes. That's a big deal. There was no way to create or enforce laws. This is a big deal. And above all, there was no central government for unity, and that's a big deal. So the Articles of Confederation, February 21, 1787, they came up with these. They adopted a resolution calling for a convention, in Philadelphia, where they would revise the Articles of Confederation. By May, all but Rhode Island had sent representatives. The debates of these revisions were kept secret until the Constitution was finished under the leadership of George Washington. God bless him forever. I'm reading a quote from James Madison from 1787 in the blue box. We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time, a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. And so this could have been written in 2023 for James Madison. He says, we've seen just because someone is a different color and we're living in the most enlightened time period of ever. And he just says, can you believe it? Here we are living during this enlightened time period. We even call that the Enlightenment, that people were discriminating based on what color they are. You just can't believe it. Dominion ever exercised over man. Other respected leaders like James Madison and Benjamin Franklin assisted. James Madison kept detailed notes of those proceedings. They were published decades later. These records tell us how the Constitution came into being. The small states didn't want to be unrecognized. The larger states felt they should have more power. That's the way it goes. If there are more of us, we should have more power. The stumbling block to progress was removed when they reached a historic compromise. They divided the legislative function between two houses, a Senate where each state received equal representation. Each state has two senators, and the House of Representatives, where representation was based on state population. So the House of Representatives has any various number of people because it's based on population. But the Senate, each state gets 2 senators. Reading Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Now, that's back history for us, but this was incredibly unique. This was incredibly profound. This was amazing. Section 2, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states. So the House of Representatives, they run for their seat again every 2 years. September 15, 1787, representatives from all 12 states approved the new Constitution. The document went to all 12 states for ratification, even Rhode Island. James Madison proposed the first 10 amendments, God bless him forever. We call this the Bill of Rights, and that was in the summer of 1789. Our Constitution opens with words like, we the people, justice, promote general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty, and domestic tranquility. Remember when we played the Constitution preamble scramble and you learned all of these phrases? Our founding fathers were revolutionary thinkers. Their oppression taught them men were not to be trusted. They set up all kinds of provisions to prevent any one leader from becoming king. Now, who was oppressing them? When they were in England, England was oppressing them before they declared before we made our Declaration of Independence. Yes, we were very oppressed. And they learned then, we started out with the king, we had charters with the king, we thought everything was going to be just a-okay, and no, that didn't work out. When someone has a lot of power, they have too much power. There's an old saying that says power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that old saying has lived on because it is completely true. It's not even generally true, it's completely true. Men are not to be trusted. So they set up all kinds of provisions to prevent any one leader from becoming king. And generally we call that the balance of power. We know from primary resources that the founders compromised their morals to ensure the Constitution would be ratified. This is an important thing to remember. They compromised. Sometimes you have to compromise to ensure something gets done. And this is otherwise, what are you going to do? You're going to compromise or go to war against each other. And later they will go to war against each other, but can you compromise, or do you have to do everything with physical force and fight each other? Sometimes there is no choice but to compromise. And that was ensuring that the Constitution would be ratified. And that was essential. That was essential not just for American history, but for world history. Free states made concessions to slave states to get the Union established. Unfortunately, slavery is extremely profitable. You just have to kidnap somebody or pay a kidnapper to do your dirty work or buy slaves from their own enemies. Many Black persons were sold by other Black persons who were selling their enemies. What better way to get rid of your enemies? Not only capture them, why kill them all? Why not sell them? It really isn't any different than Joseph's brothers who sold him to slave traders down into Egypt. Why kill him when you could avoid killing him and sell him? Get the money and be rid of him forever, never see him again. Well, that was the intent anyway. If you're not familiar with that part of the Bible, I feel really bad for you. I wish you would have taken my Old Testament survey class. This photo is from 2015. This is from an article about 60 Boko Haram girls who were kidnapped from school. They were there trying to learn in a place in the world where it's difficult for women to get an education. Actually, all Muslim areas of the world, it's difficult or else impossible for women to get an education. So they were all kidnapped from school. Their families were not there to protect them, and they're being auctioned off. And it's estimated that 9,000 girls and children are sold as slaves annually at this writing. They're sold all over the world. it's important for us to realize that slavery is not done. And if slavery in America, if you are still all worked up about slavery in America and the injustices done to your great, great, great grandparents, perhaps this would be a good ministry for you, would be to go into a ministry that's preventing slavery instead of, we can't change the past, but we can change today and we can change the future. Girls and underage girls are being sold all over the world. There were Black and white people who did sign up as indentured servants. There was a young man, can't remember his name, who was on the Mayflower, who fell off, who came over as an indentured servant. And he was going to work. It's a biblical idea. The idea, it comes from Exodus 21. The idea is that you will work for someone for 7 years, and that way you can, they actually earn a little bit usually, and you can learn a trade. So people came over on the Mayflower, you would work for them 7 years, help them build their houses and help them plow their fields, do a lot of hard work for 7 years. And that's what they would trade for their passage, or their passage here. They'd trade the passage for 7 years of service, very much like Jacob working for 7 years for a wife. Work for 7 years for somebody, that's a lot of work, and you've learned a trade. So they would work for 7 years. The idea of color-based slavery is reflected less in historical texts, and that's the moral stain on America with which we still struggle, is slavery by color. The Romans had slaves, the Greeks had slaves, and they would mark them in some way, put a ring in their ear. An earring in one ear was a famous historical way to mark a slave, tell they were a slave, or something around their neck they had to wear, something like that to identify that they were a slave. It was not based on color. That was kind of a unique American thing. And we are blaming Darwin for that, because Darwin is the one who decided that there were people who were dark skinned or looked different from us, or had slanty eyes or flat faces or whatever character trait that he decided were lesser developed humans. Without Darwin, we would not have had that idea that some people were worth less than others because some people were more closely related to animals. The whole idea, remember, that people come from animals means that some people may be more highly developed humans than others, and that gives you the excuse that you need to slide slavery right into your society. They're not as smart as us. They're not as developed as us. They're hundreds, if not thousands of years away from becoming completely human. All of those Darwinian arguments. Buying a slave from a slave trader removed the buyer from the filthy part of kidnapping, of slavery, kidnapping innocent people to be sold for a lifetime of slavery in horrific circumstances. Christians know that work is good for humankind. Work is good for us. We know right back in the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve were working well before sinning. They were working. They're not working because they sinned. Everything's harder to do work because of sin and the fallen state of the earth and of mankind. But originally, Adam and Eve were meant to work. Work is good for us. Christians know work is good for us. That's why we have children do chores, and that's why we work hard. Secularists were willing to purchase people and then call them slaves to do their work for them. And this is a big, even if we set aside the grievance of the slaves themselves, which is pretty much impossible to do, to the idea that you will pay someone to do all your dirty work. You'll pay someone to plow your fields and do all this, and then to not even pay them, to just capture them and make them do it. And again, this goes on again today, but this is really a lazy, selfish, greedy, immoral person who is going to own slaves. Natural, unregenerate man, that means mankind who has not been born again and changed their nature. If you are not a Christian, you are unregenerate. You have not been regenerated into a new person. Ask any Christian what changed their life the most, and they will say, the day I met the Lord, the day I was regenerated, the day I was born again. And that is when we change forever. Everything changes after that day. Natural, unregenerate man is easily convinced to prioritize economy over morality. Well, it's okay to have them do my work. I don't really beat them up that much. And I sure don't want to work out in the hot sun picking cotton. So we'll have these people do it. I bought them after all, they're mine. As it stands today, the loudest voices get to decide who is a person and who is not. Is this really any different than slavery? People saying, oh, that's scientifically, you're not a person until you're born. Well, now we have ultrasounds and all of that, and we realize that's not true. Uh, Mother elephants give birth to baby elephants, and mother humans give birth to baby humans. Nobody gets to decide who's a person. Science and the Bible can tell us you're a person way before you're born, and you're your own person. You're not an appendix on your mother. You're not a separate, you're not something she can get rid of like a cancer. You are a little tiny person. Because physical traits are hard to hide, skin color, you can't hide the color of your skin, eye shapes, face shapes, etc. The oppressed minorities were unable to rectify their situation by escape or revolution. They can't even say, we declare ourselves to be independent from you, because they couldn't run away. They had no weapons, they were kept from reading. And so, except in the very most unusual circumstances, slavery would have been horrific. And some people try to rewrite history. I know there's a Christian author, Douglas Wilson in Idaho, who tries to rewrite part of slavery's history and say that in many cases, slavery really, they were just kind of like servants and part of the family. And that's a slap in the face to any of us who have minorities or Black persons as part of our family, because that is simply not true. If you can't walk away, if you can't walk away, you're a slave. And if you prevent someone from walking away and make them do something for you, that's slavery. And slaves, it was because the families were separated. Think about it. Families were purposely separated because you wouldn't want to have a grandma and grandpa and all their children and their children's children all on one plantation all together, because they could rise up together and lock up the masters and walk away and probably escape. And so families were separated. And that means that that's really the worst thing that Black persons, African Americans, people who are actually from Africa, have to deal with today, is the lack of family roots, the lack of being able to go back in time and find all the people and related that were related to them. Now, most of us don't even know our great grandparents' names. I know my grandparents' names, but I know my great grandparents' names. I don't know my great great grandparents' names. Most people wouldn't be able to write those things down. And so once you get to that point, you can't really complain that you don't know what your roots are, because nobody knows what their roots are more than a couple of generations back. But physical traits, if your skin is a different color, or your face looks different, or you have slanty eyes or something like that, you just, you can't hide. You can't hide that. And this is where we have our caste system in America. It's a caste system with Darwin's influence. A secularist, someone who's not religious, could ease their conscience by claiming their slaves were lesser humans and they needed guidance and breeding like animals. When we talk about breeding humans, we're getting into something extremely evil and dark. Keeping slaves ignorant of their location, for example, on another continent, making it illegal to teach slaves to read, and denying basic human rights, kept the oppressed downtrodden, and separating families. And that is something that Black culture is still struggling with, is the separation of families. Until you adopt a Christian culture where when a couple gets married and they are expected to stay together forever, even if it's just for the sake of the children, and to treat women well just because God said so and just because Jesus said so. This is really difficult it's difficult to change cultures. Sometimes missionary groups will go off into places. We had a friend who took a group of people to do missions in India. And they had a very difficult time convincing the men to treat their women well, even after they got saved and became Christians, because Indian men, apparently, part of their society and their family structure was the women were treated poorly. And so he took his whole team over there, and he had all of the men in his team and all of these young preachers, these Indian preachers who had been saved. He had all of the men. They had a big banquet, and the men did all of the work, planning, preparing, and they served all of the women. And he had to just show them that way. God bless him forever for doing that, to show them this is the way we treat our women. They are social, spiritual equals. They may not be physical equals. They're usually smaller and have less muscle mass and have monthly things that happen that make their body out of whack. And once they have children, they usually are responsible for the children. But it's within Christianity that women have been raised up and made equals. With Darwin's influence, you're just looking at woman as the one with the smaller brain, the one who's weaker, the one who's lesser, all of that. And so by claiming that you're keeping people ignorant and claiming slaves are lesser humans, you keep the oppressed downtrodden, especially not allowing them to read. If you've ever known anyone who was illiterate, you realize what an oppression that is, to not be able to read. Once you can read, the world is wide open to you. No sooner had slavery been introduced, but abolitionists rose to point out the immorality of slavery. There's always a remnant. The Christians don't all disappear. The Christians and the Jews, they never just disappear. There are always some there, always a remnant. There are always Christians who will sacrifice even themselves for the sake of others. There will always be Christians, like Uncle Tom in our story, who will sacrifice themselves. Uncle Tom will collect somebody else's cotton. He'll take somebody's whipping. He'll help other people escape. He will not do it himself because they need him there, and his master isn't saved. And his master, he knows, is going straight to hell upon his death. And he really wants to see his master get saved. And that's why we call Uncle Tom a literary Christ type. Here we are, a new nation rising in confidence and independence, but allowing this moral corruption into entire states. A confrontation could not be too far behind. It's going to happen. There's going to be confrontation. Of course, we know it's a civil war, but it's building up at this point. Vermont abolished slavery in 1777. Pennsylvania abolished slavery in 1780. America's conscience was being pricked. Can you really boast your Constitution if it doesn't even apply to all people? In 1840, John Quincy Adams, arguing before the Supreme Court, referred to the omission of the word slave in our Constitution as the fig leaves under which the parts of the body politic are decently concealed. That's a biblical metaphor. So Adam and Eve, after they sinned, sewed fig leaves together to make garments for themselves, because then they realized they were naked and didn't want to run around naked. But it was to hide that they had sinned and to hide their private parts. And so he says the word keeping the word slave out of our Constitution was like a fig leaf. And under that, that's where we were hiding our sin, the parts of the body politic that are decently concealed. We're trying to conceal slavery by not having the word there, by calling them other persons or something like that, instead of using the word slave. Most of the framers did not want their name on a document that preferred slavery. So persons in our Constitution really meant white people, and then other persons. We count population through a census to be able to tax them and to represent them. We do it every 10 years now. The South wanted representation, but did not want to count slaves as people. So they became other persons in our Constitution. Think about, if you go to syllabus page 117, where we have our Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 is the 3/5 clause. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. And who are those all other persons? So you're not going to tax them on Indians. You're not going to get Indians to answer your census back then. How many of you are there, and then tax them, because they're not going to pay taxes. They're the indigenous people. 3/5 of all other persons. So the South wants their slaves counted. They want them counted because that gives them more power, doesn't it? Especially in the House of Representatives, because they have more people than in their state. However, the North doesn't want them to be able to count slaves as people, because the slaves don't get to make decisions or vote or anything. So what on earth are you going to do? So they made this compromise, and the 3/5 of all other persons. So the slaves, you know, if you've got 5 of them, you count 3. And it doesn't mean that they thought a slave was 3/5 of a person, although you could make that argument through Darwinian influence. But they were 3/5 of the population of the slaves was what was counted. It was a compromise. Slave states wanted more representation in the House, so they wanted slaves counted as people. I kind of just said that. This gave them more power in the House, and it impacted elections and judicial appointments. They also paid more direct tax due to the increased numbers, counting those slaves. Without this clause, would the slave states have joined the Union? Without that clause, would they have joined the Union? And historians disagree. That clause that lets them count 3/5 of their slaves, without being able to count their slaves, would they have joined the Union? Historians really don't know. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 is the cessation of importation clause. It's in your syllabus, page 121. After 1808, they are no longer going to be able to import any more slaves. Virginia wanted to stop importing slaves because so many slaves were being shipped in. It flooded the market and made the value go down. It was all about the money and the lack of morality. The slave states called it their peculiar institution. And that, if you do not understand, is a biblical metaphor, because in the King James Version of the Bible, God calls his people, the Jews, a peculiar people. And it doesn't mean they're weird. It means they are unique to him, peculiar. They are unique to him and to him only. And they are ripping this, kind of like how the LGBTQ AI plus community has appropriated the rainbow from the Bible, from the time of Noah. And the rainbow is a promise God will not flood the earth again. And they've appropriated that rainbow for their cause. Well, in this way, they said, well, this is our peculiar institution. And they're using that Bible metaphor that this is unique to us. We must have slaves because we grow cotton and it's all hot out in the sun. And you do want us out there doing the work to make money? We have to do it. So it really is all about money, and it's all about lack of morality. If there had been some really good preaching, somebody like Billy Graham down there, early, if there'd been somebody down there changing their lives, I think, as we see in Uncle Tom's Cabin, you perhaps could have stopped slavery. But money, very often money is the root, the love of money, not the money, but the love of money causes lots and lots of evil. Before slavery importation was abolished by law in 1808, it was banned in every state. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 led to resistance. The second Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which figures so prominently in Uncle Tom's Cabin, issued harsher punishments and was extremely controversial. 1850, people were ready to have war about slavery. Think about it. We are 11 years away from the Civil War, 1861. So 1850, people are really getting tired of the whole slave thing. If you live in the North, if you're in the South, you're clawing to hang on to that so that you can remain wealthy and getting wealthy. The poor refugees from slavery were attacked from every side. Remember, they can't hide because their skin is dark. And very often, their grammar is hideous. They don't know how to read, and so they don't know how to write, and they don't know proper grammar from not reading. And so they, talk funny, poor grammar, and it's really difficult to hide. They were attacked from every side. New York passed a law to stop fugitives from getting into Canada. Virginia and Maryland offered bounties catch these slaves and we'll pay you to catch them. What would the $1,850,000 fine amount to today if you were caught helping slaves to escape? How many of you, I don't imagine anyone ever watching this would say, if I caught an escaped slave, I would turn him in. Of course, and so any real Christian would never turn in a slave. And if you were caught helping a slave escape, for example, being part of the Underground Railroad or just helping a slave, if you were helping slaves escape, what would $1,000 be now in 2023? Would that be $10,000? Would that be more like $100,000? That would be perhaps your entire estate if you were old enough to have an estate. Citizens in Boston, New York, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin rescued fugitives from courthouses. They'd be taken in there and they could overwhelm the courthouse and rescue them and get them out of there and get them on their way again. It's sometimes we miss all of the good parts of American history because slavery is so hideous. We miss all the parts about people overwhelming a courthouse and stealing people again to set them free and get them somewhere where they could be safe. History is amazing, isn't it? All right, Uncle Tom's Cabin, romantic and realistic structured notes if you printed them, continuing where we left last week. Again, I think these started out as Pink Monkey notes or Spark notes or something like that. And then I rearranged them and made the information my own to add the things that I wanted to highlight. I do appreciate the things that Spark Notes and Pink Monkey Notes, those free notes online, the things that they add. You never want to use those notes to avoid actually reading the book, but they can help to highlight things you had not noticed or thought of yet. Is it a feminist novel? Is it? You've got Harriet Beecher Stowe writing it, and all the good people in the book are all women, and the women are all changing the minds of the men or trying to influence them. And this we've seen to be culturally true in many cultures, more than just in Uncle Tom's Cabin in this novel. We see that women very often can set a moral standard in a family. They can be the ones who insist on Bible reading every morning and prayer every night and things like that. Very often, women are getting credit for that. And I think as women, we shouldn't feel that because we're smaller or less strong, that we're weaker in any way. Very often, the spiritual giants in families are the women who are holding it over everyone else. Women in this book have tremendous influence, but very little real power. They can't make their husbands behave, but they can make their husbands feel guilty, and they can conduct themselves in a way. They can teach their slaves to read. They can teach their slaves about the Bible so that they marry properly. And think of all these people coming from Africa who didn't even understand about marriage, did not understand what marriage was, and had multiple spouses and had a completely different culture. Once they learn about the Christian culture, then they want to be Christians. And these slaves, teaching them about the Bible, teaching them to read, they decide they want to serve God. And they do that. And then try selling them, ripping them from that, and then sell them. Teach them all about Christianity and God's ways, and then selling them like a cow or a piece of, a cattle. They set the example, women do, and they bring out the truth to their husbands and sons. So they don't sit around quietly. They just say, God hates this. This is sin, and God hates this. We are going to pay a price for this. You're going to go to hell for this. But they are the moral standard for their family. They are the moral compass. They are intelligent, they're clever, and they're outthinking their men in most cases, very much like Shakespearean women. If you haven't studied much Shakespeare yet, you should. Shakespeare, we don't know why he had strong female characters in his books. We don't know if the women we know they dressed as men so they could save the day, because 400 years ago, a woman could not go save the day dressed as a woman. She'd be thought of as a woman, a lesser person. But if she dressed up like a man, she could go save the day. She could pretend to be a lawyer. She could escape. She could talk saucy and make things happen. And Shakespeare seemed to really enjoy that. And I don't know if that was just unique to his creativity. I would I would guess that he had some very strong women in his family that he really appreciated and enjoyed and thought, I like having female characters save the day and rescue things. It's so much fun as a woman to read Shakespeare when the women get to dress up as guys and go save the day. So they're very, very clever. And Harriet Beecher Stowe seems to feel that same way. Her women are kind of like Shakespearean women, saving the day, which is amazing. The women in this novel help each other, but they are restrained by duty or obedience to their husbands. They're still trying to be biblical, very much like women today. We want to be biblical, but we don't want to be servants. And we can be sometimes misled to think that the New Testament talks about women to serve their husbands, but men are also told to serve their wives. So it's not just women, it's all of us. We're supposed to serve each other. And within our families, we serve each other. If you go to a good Bible teaching church, then you will learn that. And even in the Old Testament, here you have in the Old Testament, there were laws created that were written down at least 1400 BC with Moses and the law after the Exodus. And part of those laws, for example, weird laws about washing your hands all the time. Well, we now can say, oh my goodness, he was saving them from death and disease by having them wash everything. And if they took captives that they wanted to marry, captives from another culture, they would have to stay outside the camp. And anything that couldn't survive going through fire had to survive going through water 7 times. And their heads had to be shaved. You're shaving the heads of women. And we think, oh my goodness, was that to just disgrace them? Well, that's how you get rid of lice and all of those terrible things. Remember, the people surrounding the Jews, the Israelites at that time, let's go back to 1400 BC, the time of the Exodus, they're eating raw meat and having all types of terrible diseases. And they don't wash everything. So they have lice and all types of horrible diseases and bugs and things because they're not clean at all. God's people, they were always washing their hands. So if your mommy makes you wash your hands all the time, she's just being a good Jewish Christian lady. And think about it. Think about all the weird laws. Laws like if you have a baby, you can't, you're unclean. You're spiritually unclean for 30 to 60 days, depending on whether it's a boy or girl. And that just sounds so discriminatory. Like, oh my goodness, the poor women, they're spiritually unclean just because they had a baby. But what happens in your family or in your tribes, 12 tribes of Israel? What happens if you are spiritually unclean? You can't go to the tabernacle or to the temple. You can't prepare food. You can't touch food that other people eat. You would not be able to you're unclean. You can't do laundry. You can't do any cleaning. You can't do any cooking. You can't go to church, temple. You can't do any of those things. And so what does that mean? It means all of the other members of your family have to do all those things for you. And I've always looked at those laws, the unclean laws after having a baby, and I say, wow, from this perspective, looking back, this really is God protecting women who are just married to blockheads, men who will not take care of them. He actually made it the law that they have to have this time of being cared for tenderly and carefully right after they have a baby. Isn't that amazing to have a different perspective on some of these Old Testament things? So, but these women, they do want to be obedient to their husbands, unless their husbands are sinning. And then they're just going to stand there and tell their husbands, this is sin. This is morally incorrect for you to do that, and make them change their minds. The exceptions are when the men disobey Bible principles. Then the women are free to act according to their consciences with the reader's blessing. You are wrong. You're sinning. And another thing, all the evil characters are men. Then you could say a couple of the women are kind of evil. They're bad anyway, but basically all the really evil people are men in this book, which I think is interesting. Mrs. Bird, she sees the truth as it is before her husband does. She practices her Christianity apart from popular custom. She just wants to do what is right or wrong. She wants to do what is right and not do wrong. She sees the truth. Her husband has voted on the Fugitive Slave Act. He comes from home from work or from Congress, and what does he have at his house? Fugitive slaves. And now he has to decide, do I really believe this or not? And here he has this young family with a child. Are they really going to go turn them in? And I don't want to spoil the story for you, but what are they going to do? And Mrs. Bird knows right from wrong. Mrs. Bird might also be modeled after Harriet Beecher Stowe herself. Stowe lost a child, Charlie. We talked about that last week, just a few years before she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Remember, she said she got inspired sitting in church one day. Stowe's brother was in New York writing against the fugitive slave law after it passed in 1850. Stowe wrote to encourage him, just like Mrs. Bird, trying to make a difference in her male-dominated world. Really is amazing, this woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was born in 1811 in Connecticut to the Reverend Lyman Beecher and Roxana Foote Beecher, and she was the sixth of 11 children. People used to have a lot of babies before birth control became available in like the 1910s or 1920s or even 1930s. That'd be a good research paper to do. And that's why everybody had big families. The Beechers expected their children to shape the world. They were not just raising up children like cattle, they were training up children to be adults. All 7 sons became ministers. That was the most effective way to influence society because everyone went to church. So if you preached against slavery, you could probably convince them. And everybody went to church. If you didn't go to church, you'd be kind of looked down on. And if you didn't go to church, other families in the neighborhood might not even let their children play with yours because you didn't go to church. So you wouldn't have that Bible influence. Their oldest daughter, Catherine, pioneered education for women. Are you liking her more and more, Harriet Beecher Stowe? Their youngest daughter, Isabella, was a founder of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Harriet believed her purpose in life was to write. Her most famous work exposed the truth about the greatest social injustice of her day, which was human slavery. Harriet made friends with law students who boarded at the family home. She attended a female seminary as a student, then later a teacher. She was a teacher at seminary. Most girls were encouraged to attend non-academic schools where they were taught simple ornamental arts, which is really a slam to women. They were taught singing, dancing, music, poetry, etc. Art, embroidery, painting, things like that, because women were thought to be ornamental. But the Christians knew, no, the women, they can teach the Bible too. The women, they can teach their sons and their husbands to be better men. If they have their nose in the Bible, their family they'll be better people. Amazing. Don't you like her? In 1851, the National Era's publisher contracted with Harriet Beecher Stowe for a story that would paint a word picture of slavery, which would run in installments. I have often thought that what we needed for abortion today was for somebody to paint a word picture of abortion, something in a novel that would change people's mind. I even had an idea for a plot, and I told it to Randy Alcorn one time. He taught a class at seminary on heaven before his book came out, and he told me it sounded like I should write a book. And I don't think I'm ever going to write a book, but I thought he'd take my idea and run with it, but he didn't. But one of you needs to write this story about abortion that would do for abortion what Harriet Beecher Stowe did for slavery, where you write the story of the women, I don't know, pick 3 women or 5 women or something, who are all, going to the abortion clinic, and somebody talks them out of it. Either somebody holding a sign on the street corner, or somebody just before they're ready to grab their keys and go, or something. Somehow something happens and they do not choose to abort their child. And then you follow, and they don't know each other. And then you follow these women and their children. And I suppose 4 out of 5 of them have to have a really hard life because they chose to keep their child. They have to be poorer, but they keep their children. And then their children, who none of them even know each other or know they have a connection, except they were going to be aborted on the same day. Then these children eventually are doing incredible things. One could be even not incredible. They could be a school board leader or a school principal or they could be a government official, or they could be a judge. They could be anybody who really changed the world because of what they did, because they were born and lived to make world changes, and then somehow get involved in some type of a project. And I would wrap up the end with they're almost all going to find out that each of them was almost aborted. They all know they were almost aborted, but not realizing that it was on the same day that somehow God sent angels to convince other people to tell them to not get an abortion, and have it all exposed at the end that they were all, each of them could have been aborted. And you either have it all come out in the end, or if that sounds too unrealistic, just let the reader know that what all these people did. I just thought that'd make a great novel. One of you better write that book. Stowe expected Uncle Tom's Cabin to be 3 or 4 installments, and then she started writing, and she wrote more than 40 installments. What about Mrs. Shelby? What do you think of Mrs. Shelby? She's kind of wussy. She's a nice lady. She's taken good care of Eliza, but what does she do when her husband has to sell the farm? She's basically, oh me, oh my, oh me, oh my. It does not occur to her that they could sell the farm that they just have to lose the farm and release the slaves and go off somewhere. Maybe some of the slaves they've been nice to would go off somewhere with them on a smaller farm. There are all types of things they could have done rather than sell off Tom. Mrs. Shelby is the reason Mr. Shelby acts in a morally Christian fashion, well, for part of the time. He clings to her shallow faith, not his own, and hers is pretty shallow. Mrs. Shelby values money more than the lives of her slaves. She doesn't want to lose everything, even if it means selling Eliza's son, selling Tom, even for that. She acts like she loves Eliza. She acts like she loves little Harry, and we presume she likes Uncle Tom's family, but she's not willing to lose everything for them. So she values money more than the lives of her slaves. Now, Mrs. Bird stands for what she believes despite her husband. So Mrs. Bird is a cool character. These women might not have the influence and power on the world that the men do, but they can exert it within the family, in the household, so that the place itself is good, even if their husbands don't agree with them. Think about what Mrs. Shelby could have done. Now, then we wouldn't have our novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, but think about what Mrs. Shelby should have done. That would make an interesting paper to do a contrast. If you've done a contrast essay before, you could contrast Mrs. Shelby and Mrs. Bird, which did right and which did wrong, and how could they have changed the outcomes, and what difference did it make? Mrs. Shelby, this pious, loving, perfect mother woman, is a recurring figure throughout the book. Mrs. Shelby is weak. She's spiritually weak, while Mrs. Bird is strong. She's spiritually strong. She might also be kind of called headstrong, and her husband has learned to listen to what she says. They provide a moral compass for their families, either weak or strong. These women urge for abolition, and they try to help the slaves as much as possible. These women may be modeled after Stowe's own birth mother, who died before Stowe was 5 and was immortalized in perfection by the Beecher family. And that does often happen. If someone dies young, they do end up kind of being immortalized. We just remember all of their good things and how wonderful the world would be if they were still here. And that might be Stowe imagining what her own mother would have done. And I would guess she would have been like Mrs. Bird. Stowe herself has social independence from her upbringing and education. Think of her upbringing. She has been surrounded by intelligent men and women her entire life, and she's educated. Most of her readers can only hope to effect change more passively, like Mrs. Bird. Most will settle for the morality of Mrs. Shelby. Most people will not give up everything they own to right a wrong. If they realize they have sinned and done something horrible, they would not sell everything they own to right that wrong. Mrs. Bird would. Mrs. Bird would have lost everything. She'd go to jail. They'd pay the fine. They would for helping slaves escape. And Stowe, her education and her upbringing has made her this way. Eliza's husband, George Harris, makes it clear that she is the only reason he has to consider doing good and not take revenge or hold revenge in his heart against all the many injustices done against him and his family. Think about it. Her husband, George, he's working for a not very smart slave owner. He's inventing things. His owner detests him because he's so smart and intelligent and inventing things. And if you're really, really smart and someone keeps you oppressed like that, I can't even imagine what it would feel like to know that you could be inventing things and making things easier for people, and that you and your own wife and child should be living together and have your own farm, your own home, and all of this. And just imagine how that would grate against him, and how he might take revenge or hold revenge in his heart if it weren't for his wife, another female Stowe character, Eliza. Eliza is the one who is constantly reminding him he can't hate people. He can't hold that in his heart. He has to forgive them. He can't take revenge. God will take care of revenge. She is the one keeping him from becoming a bad person. I think George could easily have become a bad person. And the reader realizes, wow, Eliza is keeping her husband from becoming a bad person. The most famous scene, of course, in Uncle Tom's Cabin is in the chapters that we read last week. Eliza's escape across the river, or was that 2 weeks ago? Her leap is described as miraculous, which it is, and it's a truth. It's not something that Harriet Beecher Stowe added for some dramatic effect. It's actually a real thing. Escaping Kentucky across the Ohio River is Ohio, and Ohio is a free state. So the river's almost like a River Jordan, a metaphorical River Jordan. You cross the Jordan River and you're free. Her leap is like the crossing of the Red Sea. Lots of biblical metaphors here. By the time Eliza tries to make her escape, she has the complete sympathy of the reader. And again, you could choose to do Eliza in your paper. You could even recount how many times that biblical stories are used, or biblical metaphors, comparing Tom with Joseph in the Bible and explaining Tom as a Christ type. Or you could do Tom. That would be very easy to just explain all the things Tom did that we know of in the book that make him a Christ type. It doesn't mean he is Jesus, but it means that he's really a lot like Jesus, right down to the end where he's willing. He will take the beating. He will take the stripes. He will take whatever it is. You could compare Eliza to different biblical events, crossing the Jordan River. So now she's in Ohio. She's made it that far, but then she's at the Byrds. And will Mr. Byrd turn her in? He just voted for the Fugitive Slave Act. What will they do? How is it going to happen? By the time Eliza tries to escape, everybody is sympathetic to her. All the readers think, she's got to get out of here. She's got to escape. She has to escape, and here she's got a child. So escaping from Kentucky into Ohio, if you can see this, if you're watching it on a TV screen, or if you're on your phone or something, you might have to stretch it out. But you can see, I've drawn some blue arrows. You can see Ohio, and between Ohio and Kentucky, I drew a green line, and that's the Ohio River. You get over that river, and you're in a free state. Eliza's tale, and I'm recounting for you what this plaque says. In the winter of 1838, a slave woman and her baby began their journey to freedom. Her name was not Eliza, and her baby was not Harry, but there was a slave woman and her baby began their journey to freedom. To avoid capture in Kentucky, she crossed the ice floes on the Ohio River to the safety of Ripley Shore. The story of Eliza in Uncle Tom's Cabin was based on this incident. And so here at the Ohio River crossing, they have a plaque there to tell you. And here is a station on the Underground Railroad. Tradition says Eliza Harris of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame rested here in her flight to Canada. Uncle Harriet Beecher Stowe, a lot of people said these aren't real people. These never really happened. These are all fictionized, they're all dramatized. These are all real people. The names have all been changed, to protect these innocents. And of course, at the time that this book was published, whether in the 40 installments or then a little bit later as a book, she couldn't use real names. She couldn't tell real place names because she would have exposed the Underground Railroad. She would have exposed escaped slaves. She takes all of these true stories and she weaves them into one big story, but it's all true. Okay, what about Augustine St. Clair's mother, another female in the book? Augustine credits his mother with any good thing found in him. Excuse me. As you have figured out, 19 weeks in, my voice is going. This is my sore throat kind of spray that I use so I can keep talking. Apologies. So Augustine tells Tom, if there's anything good about me at all, it's because of my mother. And he misses his mother and he longs for his mother. She's held up as nearly saintly. His mother is the reason he knows slavery is evil. That's why he's not like his cousin. Amazing, isn't it? What about little Evangeline, little Eva? Eva's sincerity and the simplicity of her faith are what finally get through to Topsy. Remember, Topsy doesn't even think that she was born. She just became. She has no idea she has a father and a mother. Topsy would be the epitome of the saddest little slave you can think of. So she has no morale. No one has taught her. No one ever put her on their knee and read her Bible stories and told her that Jesus loves her and she thinks she's bad and she steals and does all types of things because no one has ever taught her anything. And little Eva doesn't see color. And Eva is who finally gets through to Topsy. And Eva is dying. Eva delights Uncle Tom, who needs her love to keep him from being lonely away from home. Uncle Tom is away from all his family, from Chloe and his own children. And he has the realization by the time he gets to Louisiana, he most certainly thinks, I may never see my family again. And little Eva is such a delightful little Christian girl that Uncle Tom, they become friends. He literally saves her life and she delights him. She's like a little girl or a little granddaughter and will even help him read his Bible. And so he has this little friend and he knows he's doing good to this little child who is very, very sick. Eva's presence is what keeps her father from falling to pieces after messing up his life by marrying Marie. The story of Augustine St. Clair and his true love and the letters being hidden away from him and then marrying and then find out that his true love was still waiting, but then he's already married. And not only is he married, he's married to Marie. His story is just, it's so, so sad. It's horrible. And of course, there's no such thing really in this time period as divorce. And Evangeline is Marie's child. And Evangeline is his reason for living. And then the memories of his mother. He's a fascinating character also to write about, that he is, and Uncle Tom becomes his best friend. All the servants benefit from her Christian counsel and pure faith. Little Evangeline, everybody benefits. Everyone changes who has known Evangeline. Little Eva. Uncle Tom, our literary Christ type, strong but gentle. Yes, he's a stereotype. He's not a stereotype of a slave, however. He may be also, but he is the stereotype of a literary Christ type, someone who functions in the story. They always do right. They're probably bigger than life. They always make the right choice. They sacrifice their own personal happiness and for him, freedom for the sake of others. If you've ever watched any of those old Lone Ranger stories, they used to come on. They're all black and white little movies that were weekly, I believe, even before my time. But I used to watch some of those if I was homesick. And the Lone Ranger would go from place to place on his horse with Tonto, his Indian friend, and his horse, whatever the name was, the Lone Ranger, and Silver, his horse. And he would go from place to place rescuing people. He would either, catch bank robbers or he'd rescue a lone woman. And there were many times that he could have fallen in love and settled down after rescuing somebody, but he can't. And it wasn't just because they had to make a new episode next week. Well, that was why. But he never settled down because he was the Christ type. That was his job. He was so good at rescuing people that's what he did. It's kind of like an evangelist who who sacrifices personal wealth and happiness because he's got to go tell people about Jesus. And that's really what Uncle Tom is. He's a traveling Christ type. He goes from place to place, and his main concern is telling everybody about Jesus. His main concern, his flesh really wants to get back home. But his main concern is, who here is going to hell? Who can I save? Who can I tell about Jesus? So he's very strong, but he's also gentle. Secular Blacks today claim Tom is too subservient, to the point that to be called an Uncle Tom is a slam, which means you act subservient to white people. You do what white people want to do. Or sometimes you might be called an Oreo, where you look black on the outside, but you're really white on the inside. One of those. And what do you think? What do you think about Uncle Tom? Of course, we want him to escape, but if he escapes, some of those other slaves will not become Christians. And so Tom doesn't escape. He sacrifices himself. Now, if you are a secularist, if you are not a Christian, this looks like Uncle Tom is being subservient. Why doesn't he escape? He's big and strong. He could get away, and he's very smart. If anybody knew how to get away, Tom could. He doesn't read very well, and his speech is not very good. So it would be impossible for him to imitate a more learned gentleman. But what do you think? And of course, it's because he's a Christ type. And so to be an Uncle Tom really would be a compliment. But people today use that, and it's because they've never read the book. So they don't understand, and they don't even know what a literary Christ type is. There was a book, I read a book last year, maybe I'll show it to you next week, that was written about the real Uncle Tom, to talk about the person that Harriet Beecher Stowe used, the real person that she used to write her story, the person that became Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this person wrote the story, and then he was talking about the story, and he said something about that he killed an overseer. And I thought, what? Uncle Tom never would kill anybody. He wouldn't kill anybody. Uncle Tom didn't kill anybody. And then I realized, oh my goodness, the author of this book, writing about the real Uncle Tom, has never read Uncle Tom's Cabin. So actually, you can go on Amazon and read my review. You could look up reviews by Thelma English, and you could find it. I'll show you the book next week. I'll try to remember that. And realize they never read the book. And here they're talking about the book. And that's how people are using the term as a slam, and Uncle Tom. They haven't read the book. They really don't get it. What about Marie St. Clair? Oh, you gotta not like her. She really is the typical Southern belle. And of course, this is Harriet Beecher Stowe's viewpoint. She's trying to show you what a useless woman Marie St. Clair is. She's absolutely useless. She has to have people to make her clothes, prepare her clothes, dress her, undress her, take care of her baby, get up in the night with her baby. She's useless. She's completely useless. And if anybody's sick, she just imagines that she's sicker. Eva is sick. And instead of spending all the time she can with her, she thinks that she is sick. Very typical Southern belle. It's completely spoiled, completely self-centered. Stowe obviously adopts the Puritan work ethic. Work is good for everybody. Lack of work ruins a person. And from not doing anything for herself, this has ruined Marie St. Clair. She is just completely spoiled. Amazing, isn't it? Simon Legree. This is a great image of what Simon Legree would have looked like. Simon Legree is evil personified. He's out to destroy bodies and souls. His name is now an adjective for evil. People will say, oh, he's a real Simon Legree. And that means he is evil to the core. What about Sam and Andy? They're minstrel type comedians. They provide some comic relief, which is a common literary device. If you have all these if a slave just got whipped, or something horrible happened to little Eva, or something just horrible, someone got sold, something just awful, to put characters in like Sam and Andy provides a little bit of comic relief. And they are acting, they're fulfilling expectations for Mr. Shelby and the slave trader, Haley. If people think they're stupid, they're going to act stupid. And they can do all types of things to help Eliza escape by acting stupid. And so Stowe has written them into the book. They're not stupid at all. They're quite clever. It's very similar to what Shakespeare does with his fools. If you're familiar with As You Like It, you know there's a fool, Touchstone, the fool. And because he's a fool, he can say anything he wants. He's supposed to entertain and say funny things and all that. So he can say true things that make you laugh, but they're true. They can kind of hurt too. But he can do all this and get away with it, not go to jail or get whipped or anything like that, because his job is the fool. Sam and Andy in this story are kind of the comedians of the story. And so the characters, for example, Mr. Haley and Mr. Shelby, may think that they act silly and act ridiculous because they're not smart, because they've bought into the idea that Sam and Andy are stupid. And Sam and Andy actually are quite intelligent. They're intelligent enough to act stupid, to put nuts under the horse's saddle so that the horse will run crazy, and just they run around in circles talking crazy and giving people incorrect directions. They're a lovely little reprieve. Don't worry and think they're being made fun of. They're doing this on purpose to help Eliza escape, and they do a good job of it. Eliza and Harry. Who both of them are nearly white skinned. They're both only part black. They're a typical mother and child who can pass for white since they're mixed. This means they can attempt escape. All they need are some nice clothes and courage. And remember, Eliza has grown up inside the house doing household chores like a maid. She's kind of like the cross between a maid and a daughter. It has to be more maid than daughter, or Mrs. Shelby probably wouldn't have given her up. But they can escape. And also Eliza can speak well. She can probably read and write, and she's dressed well. She has nice clothes. Luke Harry has nice clothes. They can escape. All they need are, some clothes and courage. George gets to give a beautiful speech later on. Her husband George has an incredible speech about, is America his land? Is America the free? Is he free? So is America his? Does he even care? It's quite interesting. And this opened up all types of problems. You'll read Mrs. Stowe at the very end of the book with her suggestion that all of the African Americans who want to go back to Africa can go back and Christianize and start colonies there again and get back into tribal families and things like that. But as it turned out, the Black people who were forced to come here to America and were sold, they didn't want to go back. Very similar to Muhammad Ali when he went to Africa and visited, and he came back and they said, "Hey, champ, what do you think about Africa?" And he said, "Thank God my daddy got on that boat. My granddaddy got on that boat." But that's to say, thank God my granddaddy got on that boat and was sold as a slave, because it brought my family here to America, and I'd rather be American. I don't want to go back to Africa to live. So you have this conundrum where these people have been stolen and brought over here, but hardly anybody really wants to go back. They all want to stay in America. It's anyone being kidnapped from anybody and being brought to America, and then growing up here and having your parents in America. Do you really want to go back? Not really after a generation, and certainly not after 2 generations, because then this country is yours. You don't want to go back to Africa. You just want to be free. You just want to live here and be free. Eliza and Harry. Now, Mrs. Stowe knows that Northerners can relate better to nearly whites than Blacks. So she gains the reader's sympathy through them both. Tom is too dark to escape attention. George can kind of pretend like he's Spanish, and he speaks extremely well. He's extremely intelligent. He can pass for a Spaniard, just somebody else that's kind of dark skinned, and people will be convinced that he's not a slave. And Eliza, she can convince people she's not a slave. And Stowe uses that to their advantage. It's going to be much easier for them to escape than it would be for 2 people who were extremely dark and couldn't speak well. Is motherhood the central focus for women? And yes, I believe it is. You could concentrate your paper on that, motherhood as the central focus for women in the book, and then you could explore each of the main female characters and perhaps what they were based on what I've been telling you in presentations for the last few weeks. There's only one bad woman in the book, and she was really forced into doing those bad things, and it's kind of become bad. Old Prue, but she's really not bad. She's just been forced into this awful, awful, terrible life. And the women help one another out. The women generally help each other. The men are better because of their godly women's influence. That's true all around the world today still. A good woman does change the shape of her home and family. Should it be her job to do that? Well, no. We all hope that the guy will lead the family and be the strongest Christian in the family, the spiritual leader. But what if they're not? Then the woman steps up. And if she does that, she's doing a good thing. The women help the men to make morally correct choices, and they force them to face moral issues. Mrs. Shelby could have said, I don't care if we don't have anything. I don't care. Sell my jewelry, sell the farm, and what we have left over, because Tom wasn't worth the whole value of the farm. Selling Tom was not, Tom's worth was not the whole value of the entire farm. It was to rescue them. He could have sold the farm, paid off his debts, and then they could have gone to a smaller farm, a smaller place. And perhaps if they had been treating their slaves well and keeping the families together, they might have even joined them as kind of servants in this venture and able to kind of earn bits and have their own places on that farm and become part of that farm life, not as slaves, but maybe, indentured servants. Help us for 7 years, and then you can start building on your own things. There were all types of ways out of this they didn't have to do. Mrs. Shelby, if she had been a different woman, she could have changed the course, but then we wouldn't have this story, Uncle Tom's Cabin. George Shelby Jr. is the hope of tomorrow. This is Mr. Shelby's son, who is just completely flabbergasted that his father has sold Tom, and he just can't believe his father sold Tom, and he sets out on a mission to find Tom. Young George is the hope for the future. He gives Tom that silver dollar when Tom leaves. And I once had a student who wrote a paper about the dollar, the journey of the dollar as it changed hands going from place to place, and told the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin through the eyes of what that coin could have seen. And it was just a beautiful paper. He's the hope for the future. He loves Tom, and he's going to change the future when he grows up. He's going to be able to do the right thing to free the slaves on his father's land. He just simply knows right from wrong, and he's going to do right. I'm going to read you an article from the Ladies' Companion. This is from 1840. This is not an 1840 issue. It's 1937, but 100 years earlier. This is an article from 100 years earlier. Unseen, unfelt, she extends her influence far and wide. She is forming the future patriot, statesman, or enemy of his country. More than this, she is sowing the seeds of virtue or vice, which will fit him for heaven or for eternal misery. Noble, sublime is the task of the American mother. See that it be well performed. Isn't that great? That's just from this article. Okay, plots in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's, I didn't let you see that. Uncle Tom's story is a bondage narrative. You know that you read Mary Rowlandson's narrative, her escape narrative, that was actually a genre, and her ransom and all of that. Well, Uncle Tom's story is a bondage narrative, and plenty of those have been worth reading. And if you're not convinced of the horrificness of slavery in America's past, read a few more books. There are all types of Black people who learned how to read, slaves who learned how to read and write and wrote excellent books. There's more than just, I'll have to look at my bookshelf here, more than Frederick Douglass, excuse me. There are books written, there are more people like Frederick Douglass, nobody exactly like him, but other great authors. It's written, Uncle Tom's Cabin is written with a particular audience in mind, and it's actually written for the people in the North in order to educate them about what was happening in the South. I've never been to Louisiana, and I'm 65 years old. Many Northerners never visited the South or didn't even want to visit the South. It's like another world. For readers in 1852, the book shook very foundations of somebody's world if you were in the North. If I was in Oregon today, I'm in Oregon today, and I was reading that slavery was going on in Louisiana, our church we send people down there, missionaries down there, or if I was young, might go myself to go and see if we could change what's going on in Louisiana. That's why people go on mission trips all over the world. They go somewhere to try and change and make something different. Make people treat their women better, or make them quit buying and selling, or just help them to understand how to read, and that God loves them and that Jesus died for them also. So the whole idea of this is to educate people in the North about what's happening in the South. For readers in 1852, this really is just shocking. In an era of little communication, just think about it. They have magazines, none of it in real time. Right, readers were shocked to righteous anger and action. There's no radio, and there are no national newspapers. There's magazines, but there's no radio, there's no TV. For example, think about all the wars. The first war that made it to TV in almost real time was the Vietnam War. And our attitudes about war changed completely after the television. Everything. When you had reporters going into war and taking videos of young American men dying in Vietnamese jungles and all of the horrible things that were going on, nobody was supportive of the war anymore. World War I, it was kind of looked like as a noble thing. It was the war to end all wars. Even World War II was prior to television, and you had people learning how to kill people better and trying to rescue the free world and keep the free world free and not allow Hitler to take over the entire world or any other country, Italy or Russia or anything like that. And so this really shook them up to realize that this was going on right under their noses. The book starts in Kentucky. And you have to remember this. You have to know where the book starts and where the book goes to. The book starts in Kentucky. It's the northernmost slave state. And that's easy for us as the reader. Then if we had started out in Louisiana on a cotton plantation, a lot of people might just say, oh, I can't read this. I just can't read this. And so it starts out in Kentucky with a little milder form of slavery. Then it progresses to New Orleans and then a little further south onto the plantation in Louisiana, which is in the deep South. And that gives the reader time to kind of acclimate to this world of slavery slowly, rather than simply being shocked from the first sentence. If Stowe had based her book on the plantation alone in Louisiana, I don't know, would she have had a broad audience? Would we have read it? Would you have read it in 1852? I don't know. True to the best of theistic romanticism, Stowe weaves multiple complicated subplots into one nearly epic adventure. And this is the best of theistic romanticism. It's romanticism. You have exotic characters, faraway places. You have a Christ-type figure. You have multiple plots, multiple subplots. It's not just action of a day. It's Tom's, it's a great part of Tom's life, and it's like an epic. And so it's absolutely awesome, and it's Christian. So you agree with the morality of the Christians in the book. Her characters are well developed to gain the reader's sympathy. Her goal is to affect pity and righteous anger from her readers. Stowe's style is to directly talk to the reader. Now, people don't do that much more in books nowadays, but she directly spoke to the reader using a first-person address with words like us and you, very conscious that this book has her views and is intended for a certain audience. And she will say something, well, and you, dear reader, what would you have done? I love the way she does that. Her point of view is omniscient. That means she knows everything. She knows what everybody's doing and what they're going to do and what's going on all around. And Christian, the author knows all, and Christians, our consciences are pricked. Before Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, Stowe wrote what women were expected to write, entertaining parlor literature. It's called parlor literature. Long, detailed letters that were meant for a family to read out loud before a group, kind of like a travel journal or an essay on an important matter. And they would call that parlor literature. Think about it. There was no TV to watch in the evening. You could sit around and read books, or you play chess or play checkers, play a game or something like that. But for entertainment, without radio or television or movies, you had parlor literature. So someone who got a magazine or a letter, you would sit around and read it out loud, and then you could talk about it. Or if you went somewhere, you would write all the things that you saw and the things that you discovered, and comment. You'd do word pictures of all this and then send it to your friends, and they would read this around the family in the parlor, and it would be entertainment. Uncle Tom's Cabin was first published in episodes in a newspaper, and then it took a form similar to these parlor letters. And in these letters, Stowe's voice would be strong and clear. She treats Uncle Tom's Cabin in a similar manner, speaking directly to her readers. You, dear reader, what would you have done? It's a book of her creation with word pictures painted for other people, with a very recognizable author's voice creating the entire story, as though it's written for some friends up north. Tom's story, again, begins in Kentucky. Kentucky, I already read this part. Apologies for the duplicate. It just across the Ohio River, though, is the free state of Ohio, where the birds live. The Shelby family, they own a house in Kentucky. They've got a farm. They have slaves, including Uncle Tom. All seems quite well. Tom seems to be kind of happy running the farm for his friend, Mr. Shelby. Tom apparently is never whipped or punished. He has a wife, he has children, and his wife can bake things in her free time, a lot of free time, I suppose, but she can bake things and sell them in town. That's what she does to try and earn money to buy Tom back, as though she could sell enough cakes to buy Tom. The reader kind of knows that is a pipe dream from the beginning. But Tom acts more like he's just the farm manager, the guy in charge. Mr. Shelby gets into financial trouble, and his most valuable possession is Tom. After Tom has been sold downriver, it'd be different if he had been sold to another farm right next door. Mr. Shelby could hope to get him back. Still wouldn't be right, but they could hope to give him back. But to sell him to a slave trader and then to get sold downriver was kind of like the beginning of the end. If you were sold downriver, and we'll hear that in Huckleberry Finn when we get to Huckleberry Finn too, that going downriver is going to give a slave the heebie-jeebies, because they know every time you go further south, life is going to get worse. So south on the Mississippi River. The story still flashes back to Kentucky and tells us about the letter that Tom wrote to Chloe. Remember, Eva helped him write a letter, and how she worked baking cakes, I think, to try to make money to buy back her husband. Master George, the young master, is growing up throughout the beginning of the book, and at the end leaves Kentucky to go to the Louisiana plantation to find Tom. And imagine all of this research without a detective, without telephones, without radios and any of that. Imagine just trying to find somebody again after you've sold them. When he returns home, he's going to set his slaves free. Uncle Tom, sold to a trader because of Mr. Shelby's debts. He saves a girl's life. He saves little Evangeline while on a boat, and then Evangeline's father, Augustine St. Clair, buys her almost like a toy for his daughter, really to keep his daughter entertained. He spends several years in New Orleans, in Louisiana, on the Mississippi River at their house, helping Augustine St. Clair, the father, to find God. That's what Tom figures his purpose is. When Eva and St. Clair are unable to help him anymore, he's sold to an evil plantation owner in Louisiana. On the plantation, he continues to be religious, even when God seems to have abandoned him. He helps two women escape and is beaten. Tom could escape, but it would bring Legree's wrath down on those weaker slaves. So Tom chooses to stay to protect other people. George, Eliza, little Harry. At the same time, Uncle Tom was sold in a different plot. Eliza and Harry, two other slaves of Mr. Shelby, escaped after learning that their owner intended to sell little Harry, Eliza's son. They're going to sell him to just be entertainment for somebody. They meet George, Eliza's husband, who is also escaping, and with much help from the Quakers, the three of them make it into Canada. Their story is a freedom narrative. And these two plots contrast. Uncle Tom's story is an example of a bondage narrative, and the other plots are examples of freedom narratives. Other slaves escape. Weaving these two opposing stories together enabled Stowe to reveal the horrors of slavery through Tom's decline while keeping the inspiring plot of possibilities. Will Eliza and George, will Cassie and Emmeline escape? And then some surprise things at the very end that are absolutely wonderful. But if we just heard bondage narratives about slaves, it might be just too awful. We might say, I have to put it down. I just can't read it. But with those stories of hope, some are hopeless and some are filled with hope. And weaving those together makes the novel bearable to read. Life at St. Clair's house kind of shows us that there is this philosophical question about slavery. St. Clair doesn't do any work of his own. He loves his daughter and he married his wife, and he spends long hours talking with Uncle Tom about what's right and wrong. And that's the setting for most of the book. Stowe uses the different characters in this scene, especially Miss Ophelia, his cousin from up north, to depict some of the different philosophical questions about slavery, as well as about religion and feminism. It's in St. Clair's house that Miss Ophelia struggles with training Topsy. Does Miss Ophelia hate slavery? And does she love Topsy? Topsy can tell that Miss Ophelia doesn't really want to touch her. Miss Ophelia wants her. She wants Topsy for her own. She wants to have her for a daughter to train her up. But Miss Ophelia has to learn to love her first. Topsy is that renegade kid that you have adopted, who's never had anything right done in her family before and will probably take you a lifetime to convince her that you really love her. And that's really what Topsy's character is. The person who's had no love, doesn't even know she had parents. Think how difficult that would be to be a little girl, and she doesn't think she's just adopted or sold. She thinks she just came out of nowhere and has no idea that there ever would be family. And so Miss Ophelia can be that family. But my guess is that's another book, and that would be a lifetime accomplishment for Miss Ophelia to help Topsy get straightened out. Legree's plantation is slavery at its ugliest in the Deep South. Now, I know we talk about this every week, but here we go again. The consequences of man as an animal. And we call this social Darwinism. If you are an animal, then Darwin is right. In 1859, Darwin had published his famous On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Which offspring have the ability to survive? Nature makes that choice, and we call that natural selection. The stronger one survives. With savages, and don't get tired of this, I hope you have it half memorized. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the progress of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. And that's from my edition. It's in Descent of Man, chapter 5, if you want to find it. I do suggest that you eventually read Darwin. There are books now being written that are whitewashing Darwin, trying to say he wasn't really racist and slavery really wasn't his fault. He didn't really condone it or help it along. Darwin suggested that some races may be more advanced or civilized than others, and this idea was used by some people to justify enslavement and the belief in the superiority of certain races. If there is more than one human race, if life rose up on all continents separately, and we are descended from apes, then of course some will be further along than others. If we are all descended from Adam and Eve, then there is only one race, and that is the human race. Darwin also proposed the idea of eugenics, which is not popular to talk about today, which is the belief that it is possible to improve the genetic quality of a human population through selective breeding. This idea was later used to justify forced sterilization of criminals and other heinous practices. Criminals were thought, it was thought their kids will be criminals. And so we want to sterilize them so they don't have any children. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. There we go. That's how to do it. And of course, this is Friedrich Nietzsche. a German philosopher and cultural critic. He's going to take this idea and run with it. Nietzsche's ideas about the Übermensch, or Superman, that's what Übermensch means, advocated for the selective breeding of humans in order to produce a superior race. If you got rid of all the inferior people in just one generation, or just sterilized all the criminals, all the people you thought were inferior, sterilize all of them, then in one generation, you could change the world and have just all better people, superior race. I found this from a Kansas Fair poster in 1920. It's for nurses, and the triangle of life. So please make this bigger if you can't see it on your phone. And you see, you can improve your education and even change your environment. But what you really are was all settled when your parents were born. Selected parents will have better children. This is the great aim of eugenics. And on the left, unfit human traits. This is 1920. This is thought to be passed down, such as feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, criminality, insanity, alcoholism, pauperism, being poor, and many others run in families and are inherited in exactly the same way as color in guinea pigs. If all marriages were eugenic, we could breed out most of this unfitness in 3 generations. What do you think of that? This would be great for a discussion tonight around the dinner table. Shock everybody, or a discussion at the end of class today. All good things were formerly bad things. Every original sin has turned into an original virtue. And this is Friedrich Nietzsche. I don't know if I ever want you to read Friedrich Nietzsche. You might have to read some of him to realize just how shockingly disgusting these ideas are. We call this nihilism when everything basically is bad. You have to just make your meaning for yourself. And whatever you want to call good, you're going to call good because nothing really matters. And that's nihilism. It kind of, a lot of times it leads to suicide. Nothing matters. And I'm just an animal anyway. I'm an accident of fate. Nihilism is the belief that life lacks meaning and that values, morals, and beliefs are unfounded. Because the Bible, if there's no God, there's no Adam and Eve or original people. We're all just accidents. And what we decide to be good is good. And what we believe, religious view, it's just because we don't want to deal with reality. It's a philosophy that suggests life is meaningless and it rejects any sense of purpose. You were not made. You just are an accident of fate. Nihilists believe life is meaningless. Nihilism rejects the idea of moral truth, that some things are true for all people in all places and all ages. And that would be what Christianity teaches, that there is moral truth, something that is true, what's in the Bible for all people, everywhere and in all ages. It doesn't get old. This means, though, if you believe that there's no moral truth, there's no moral distinctions. Individuals should follow their own moral inclinations. There's no good, there's no bad. Nietzsche wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil. Don't you say to me what's good or what's evil. And they seek to find a truth that works for whatever they choose as a lifestyle. There's no other world, not even this one. What then is there? The inner smile provoked in us by the patent non-existence of both. Kind of crazy. A nihilistic worldview leads to feelings of despair, hopelessness, and meaninglessness. Some people may turn to nihilism as a reaction to the suffering and injustice they see in the world. What difference does it make what I do? I can't change the world. Without an understanding of biblical justice and redemption, the nihilist sees the world as cold, cruel, and meaningless, even acting as a force against them. Nihilism and nihilistic literary critics are extreme pessimists. Christianity works through imperfect people as the body of Christ to better the world. Christians are the ones who built the hospital, take care of the sick people. They're not looking to get rid of them. And they care for the needy. They're not looking to get rid of them. They're looking to tell everybody about Jesus. Christian influence can't be overestimated. You cannot overestimate Christian influence. The problematic, low power mode, excuse me, while I plug in my phone, which functions as my camera. and occasionally I forget to plug it in. There we go. The problematic nihilism in artistic and literary sarcasm and critique, for the little devil in you to think that's so silly, this is so wrong, that's ridiculous. And then you think, how am I supposed to know? How do you make things? How do you make things right and better than if you don't even know what is good and wrong? How do you know those things? Nihilism has no answers. Darwinists imagine society as a blind machine, godless and aimless. Okay, time for the comparisons, and feel free. I'm going to run through these rather quickly. If you want to do these on a whiteboard in class or with your parents around the kitchen table, pick some topics and then examine them from the theistic view, which means to examine your evidence on the topic theologically, or the deistic view, examine the evidence scientifically, or the romantic view, which examines evidence emotionally. And what are the topics you could pick from? You could pick from human life. What does the theist say about human life? What does the deist say? What does the romantic say? And the meaning of diversity. What on earth does that mean? The theist would say diversity, variety reflects God's creativity. He didn't make us all the same. Thank you, Lord, for not making us all the same. Even thinking to make us male and females is absolutely amazing. Absolute truth for all people at all times in all places. And then what does the deist say? What does the romantic say? Of course, the romantic is going to follow their heart. Truth is individual. Every view has equal truth. What about the Constitution? What does a theist say? What does a deist say? What does the romantic say? The romantic's always going to say things are changing, ever changing, always changing. What about law? Does law change? Should laws change? Is there a universal law? How do you know what a bad law is? And human nature. What does a theist say? Depraved, have to be reborn, born again. We just presume there is a corrupt nature. What does a deist say? You got to study mankind and find out what makes him tick and see if we can make him better. And the romantic, of course, is the unique individual, which a theist believes also, but the idea that each person has to find their own truth. Well, I would never have an abortion, but if that's good for you, then that's your truth. That's what you have found. What about marriage? And you can talk these through. What do you think? Make the comparisons. What does a theist say about marriage? What does a deist say? And what does a romantic say? The romantic says, follow your heart. And I love, this is my closing quote. I love this quote. I sure wish I still had the book. It's a female author. I have Googled this, put this into Google search engines, and I still can't find it. So the author is unknown. The Bible is like a vine with branches spreading across time and continents. The scriptures have provided inspiration for the greatest musicians, poets, artists, and scientists. All moral progress of our race, the human race, is directly from the Bible. Try to imagine removing the influence of the Bible from all of our art, architecture, law books, scientific laws and theories, poetry, music. What would you have left? And some people have written books to try to talk about what it would be like. The Bible is the dividing line between chaos and civilization. All right, you're reading chapters 19 through 27 of Uncle Tom's Cabin this week. There will be a reading quiz again next week for Uncle Tom's Cabin until we finish the book. Excuse my voice. These are my resources. God and the Constitution, Paul Marshall. I really like that book. God and Government, Gary DeMar. I like that book. He does another American history set that's 5 volumes that's also very good, talking about the Constitution. Vital Issues of the Constitution. That's really an old book that I just happen to have on my shelf. And other sources are right there. Okay, the Lord bless you, and I will see you next week. Bye.